Welcome, everyone. I'm incredibly grateful to have Judith Blackstone join me today to discuss the realization process, an embodied approach to psychological and relational healing. By the end of this session, you'll have a greater understanding of the realization process and will learn practices to cultivate an experience of internal wholeness and to deeply connect with others while maintaining inward contact with oneself. Judith is a wonderful and innovative teacher in contemporary spirituality. She developed the realization process and is author of Belonging Here, The Intimate Life, The Enlightenment Process, and The Empathic Ground. A very warm welcome to you, Judith. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Yes, today I'm going to talk about the realization process, and then I'm going to teach a practice or two that can be helpful for us if we are dealing with the effects of trauma. The realization process is basically a series of practices, actually series of gentle inward attunements to ourselves that can uncover an aspect of ourselves that isn't often spoken about, but can be experienced and is experienced as very subtle, unbroken consciousness. This consciousness can be experienced pervading our own body and at the same time pervading everything around us. In the realization process, I call this consciousness fundamental consciousness. But interestingly, it's been mentioned in many of the realization lineages, traditional lineages, especially in Buddhism and Hinduism, where it's given various names, but it is referred to. And teachers throughout the ages have described this experience. So the realization process can just facilitate our uncovering of this aspect of ourselves. And what's really important about it is that because it pervades our whole body all at once, I mean, that's the experience of it when we uncover it. We feel it pervading everywhere in our body. It gives us a sense of our internal wholeness, of our whole being at once. And at the same time, because it also pervades our environment, it gives us the ability to connect deeply with other people, with nature, with everything in our environment, without losing inward contact with ourselves. So this ground of our being, that's how it's felt. It has importance for our healing, and not only our healing from past trauma, but our ability to be resilient and tolerant to experiences, present day experiences that might be difficult, that might be very challenging. Right? So because it pervades our whole body and we experience this internal wholeness, this deep contact with ourselves, we are able to think, feel, and sense, perceive, and act as a whole. Now, traumatic experience has the tendency to fragment us, right? And I'll talk more about that later in this presentation. It fragments us because we cannot, as a whole being, especially as children, take in whatever that experience is, whether it's an angry parent or actual abuse, whatever it is, being fed when we're not hungry, we have to limit our taking in of that experience. We have to limit our experience. Interestingly, we cannot limit our experience without constricting our body, right? So, for example, if we start to cry and we want to control those tears, we can't do it unless we tighten in the actual anatomy that's involved in our crying. If we want to keep back our own anger or lessen the impact of someone else's anger or any sort of abrasive experience, we can't do it except by tightening our own body. Now, this tightening of ourselves actually cuts off bits of ourselves from our self-experience, right? From how we experience who we are. It limits just to some small extent, but enough to be important. It limits our ability to be emotionally responsive, right? Because if we constrict our heart a little bit, then that limits the fluidity of our emotions, the depth of our emotional response. If we're told over and over again, for example, that we're stupid, or if we just sit at the dinner table with our older siblings, for example, and feel stupid, we will actually constrict just a little bit of our actual intelligence, right? So we fragment ourselves and limit ourselves, constrict ourselves in reaction to abrasive or traumatic experience, right? When we are in the midst of a traumatic experience, for example, what we all went through with the pandemic, various experiences that are affecting us as a country, as a world, we also contract, right? We contract, we lift up in anxiety, and in that way we fragment ourselves. So the more we can uncover this fundamental consciousness, the more we can regain and actually anchor into our wholeness, right? We can experience whatever is happening around us without limiting our own being. Another way of saying we can tolerate, we can encompass whatever is happening. Right? So the basis of our wholeness, our ability to think and feel at the same time, feel and experience pleasure, even sexual pleasure, at the same time that we're feeling emotion and cognition, right? Really being a whole. Fundamental consciousness is also experienced as the ground of our being. So it's experienced as who we really are. It's a very interesting feeling, who we really are. But many of us know the feeling of not being quite who we really are, of having had to keep on a happy face, or in some way adjust ourselves to feel equal with other people growing up, especially sensitive people who often feel overwhelmed by other human beings, right? That we've adjusted ourselves in certain ways. We call them masks or persona, and those become static habits. They become habitual. But as we get to this fundamental consciousness, we have a sense of authenticity. Like this is who I really am. We also have a sense of actually taking up space. And again, going back to that constricting of ourselves in reaction to trauma, we can grow up, we can get to adulthood feeling very kind of flattened against the world, like the world just impinges right on us. And we have very little to come back towards that stimuli, right? Towards the sounds and the vibrations of other human beings. We feel kind of flattened against the world, as if the world is affecting us much, much too strongly for us to tolerate. Again, we're getting to that ability to tolerate experience. But when we uncover fundamental consciousness pervading our whole body, well, I'm going to give you a little glimpse of how to do that later in this presentation. When we uncover it, we feel that we take up space, that we have internal volume. That's a wonderful feeling. We have a palpable sense of existing. And again, it's fantastic because it feels like, oh, my existence is just as potent as anyone else's, right? That we can walk out into the world and feel equal with other people and then interact with them with much less fear. Very often our fear of other people is basically fear of being annihilated, of losing ourselves in relationship. But when we actually have this felt experience of our existence all the way through our body, we no longer have that fear that other people can wipe us out, overpower, or annihilate us. Now, speaking of overpowering, being overpowered, one thing that occurs when we attune to fundamental consciousness pervading our whole body is we also uncover innate qualities. So it's not blank space. Sometimes we can experience it as luminosity or as a sense of beingness, but it's not empty. It has actual qualities. And when I say innate, I mean we don't need to construct them. We don't need to imagine them. We can attune to them. We do that in the realization process. But again, it's an uncovering rather than a creating. Now, I have named the qualities, and of course, the names that I attribute to these qualities are just words that I have found that for me best express what these qualities feel like. So the words may or may not make sense, but they're just words. But when we, for example, inhabit our midsection between our ribs and our pelvis, we can attune to, actually spontaneously feel, a quality that feels like power, that feels like our personal strength. And power, many of us have taboos against feeling power, that we might try to overpower someone else or be too powerful. But in fact, because of all the other qualities in our being, that sense of power is balanced. But it's a wonderful feeling to actually know that right within our own body is that feeling and experience that I'm calling power, strength, personal strength. It's very important in terms of healing from trauma, because one of the main things that occur in traumatic experience is a squelching of our own power. Many of our traumatic experiences involve being overpowered. And actually, nobody can reach into our body and take these qualities from us. That's the good news. But in reaction to these experiences, we squelch our own power. So to attune back to that quality and feel that, in fact, it's still there. We've only suppressed it. We haven't destroyed it. We can't destroy this basic ground of ourselves. It's still there, and so we can regain that power that we squelched in reaction to trauma. The same with these other qualities that we uncover in our body, our sexuality. For us, the regaining of even the sense of gender, whether it's our biological gender or not, but just a sense of that basic quality in our being, having been challenged or threatened, or having seen images of that gender or sexuality that are not appealing. We have again constricted those qualities in our own being, and to regain them is regaining of our wholeness, of our self-enjoyment, right? We regain our voice, the quality of our voice, actual experience of our voice, again, something that's often suppressed as we're growing up. We regain our ability to love and our ability to respond emotionally as we inhabit our chest area. Right? We regain an actual feel of our intelligence and our understanding. It has a quality, right? It's not just a function, it's a feeling. We can feel our intelligence. And when we feel it, it's not so easy to tell ourselves that we're stupid, right? It's not so easy, right? To feel that we're unequal to other people, right? When we actually feel our intelligence, right? So all this goes to a sense of regaining our ability to enjoy ourselves, to appreciate ourselves, which again is one of the main things that we lose in traumatic experience, right? We lose a sense of our goodness very often. This happens especially when we're abused as children. I don't know why, and many theorists have put forward various theories, and children seem to believe in a just world, right? So when we're abused, we tend to blame ourselves for that, right? And so one of the most important things I've found for healing from trauma is the ability to regain self-love, right? Actual appreciation and enjoyment of ourselves. And that comes with that experience of our own qualities. How can I hate myself when I feel love spontaneously welling up in my chest. Not love that I've created, that I'm imagining or pretending to have, but actual experience of love. So very important aspects of healing. Now, fundamental consciousness pervading our body and our environment at the same time, as I've said, means that we can connect deeply with our environment. And what's most important for most of us is that connection with other human beings without losing inward contact with ourselves. So this is an aspect of healing, what we call attachment disorders or attachment difficulties, our fear of other people, our general protection against being intimate for a variety of reasons, because we're afraid again to feel that old sense of abandonment, perhaps, right? Or we're afraid of being annihilated, overpowered. We're afraid of being simply rejected. But when we connect with ourselves, when we don't lose that inward contact with ourselves, we're still there and present with our self-love for ourselves, even when we're connecting with another person. And then we can take that chance, right? We can take maybe they won't return our love in the same way. But that doesn't mean that I'm abandoning my own self. So all of those difficulties that come up in relationship can be facilitated, the healing can be facilitated through this deepening contact with ourselves and this unveiling of fundamental consciousness. I call it an unveiling or revealing of it, uncovering of it, because it does feel like it's just waiting there to be discovered. It's, in the spiritual literature of both Buddhism and Hinduism, it's referred to as uncreated, right? It's just there. It's a given, like our physical anatomy. It's a given. It's part of nature, and that's the feeling of it. That as we become more open, it's naturally there. That very, very fine consciousness, that unbreakable consciousness that pervades our own being and everything around us. Now, one of the aspects of the realization process, right? We start by inhabiting the body, and it's quite a shift from being aware of the body to actually enter into the body. And so we do have a practice of doing that, which is the main practice of the realization process. We practice inhabiting the body and then experiencing that the space outside of the body and the space inside of our body is actually one continuous expansive space. That I'm calling fundamental consciousness. And not that it's something separate from us, but that we experience it as our own being, as our own consciousness revealed. When we attune to it with another person, they also experience it as their own consciousness. And yet the feeling of attuning to it with another human being is that we're both attuning to the same one consciousness. Here's another very interesting thing. It's a mystery. I don't know what it really is, but I have heard, for example, Hindu teachers say, for example, I say I am Judith, you say I am Jeffrey, but it's the same I in all of us. So again, I don't know what that really means, but that is the experience. It's a beautiful description, very clear description of what it feels like. That even though I find this very subtle consciousness in the depth of my own being, when I attune to it with someone else who's also attuning to it, we feel that we're both attuning to the same one undivided expanse of consciousness. Right? So our deepest connection with ourselves, in a way, our deepest intimacy with other people, this sense of actual oneness. When we experience that oneness between our own being and someone else as fundamental consciousness, those qualities that I was talking about, right, that I've named, power, for example, or voice, they resonate because these qualities are pretty much the same in all of us. right? So there's a resonance, which is a quickening, a deepening of the experience of contact with another human being. So it's not only that oneness of fundamental consciousness, it's also a resonance, an enhanced contact, quality to quality, quality to quality. Our senses themselves are also enhanced when we know ourselves as fundamental consciousness. There's a unification altogether. This is an uncovering of oneness, an experience of oneness. So the experience is that all of our senses are occurring at the same time, that we're seeing and hearing at the same time. Right? So there's also an experience because we actually experience permeability, that this fundamental consciousness pervades our own body and even the water glass, the computer, as well as other human beings. There's an experience that we can see within, right? Now, I can't see what's behind the chair, behind my computer monitor, but when we are with another human being, we do get a sense of being able to see beyond the skin, beyond the features, the shape, to the being within. So there's even a sensory experience of another human being on a deeper and more subtle level. Now, in addition to inhabiting the body and attuning to this pervasive space and its qualities, we also attune in fundamental consciousness, in the realization process, to a very fine channel that runs through our torso, neck, and head vertically, right? Very fine innermost core of ourselves. And this core is mentioned in Hindu yoga, it's called Sushumna. In Tibetan Buddhism, it's called the central channel, obviously in English translation. So again, for many generations, we have known that we can find this innermost core of ourselves. And that is, again, an entranceway, a portal into the pervasive space of fundamental consciousness, into our individual wholeness and our oneness with everything around us, this very subtle channel. So in the realization process, and I think this is the practice that I'm going to really focus on teaching you today in this presentation. We find points along this core, and we practice breathing within them. And what that does for us is it cultivates the most subtle level of our energy system. Right? Our energy system, by the way, let me back up a little and say that in the realization process, we actually make a distinction between three ways that we can experience ourselves: as physical matter, right? You know, that thing that's going to hurt if we bang it against the desk. As energy, that swirling, streaming, vibrating, pulsing aspect of ourselves that many of us as sensitive people grow up experiencing, pervading our own being and everything around us. Energy and the stillness of fundamental consciousness. Actually experience the stillness, deeper, more subtle than our energy system. However, our energy system itself is designed on a spectrum from dense to subtle. So when we get into this core of ourselves, this vertical core, innermost core of ourselves, which I call the subtle core of the body in the realization process, we get to the most subtle level of our energy system, and that integrates our breath, our physical breath, with our energy system so that we can feel breath everywhere in our body. We can feel that very subtle energy breath everywhere in our body at the same time as we feel the stillness, as we know ourselves as the stillness of fundamental consciousness. And what this does is helps us regain our vitality, right? Again, something that we lose in depression, right? When we despair, either about the world situation, our own personal situation, right? When we surrender to that dark feeling hopeless feeling, we can counter that with this very subtle breath energy that we can feel everywhere in our body at once. There's a kind of vitality. Now, interestingly, again, the realization process doesn't work specifically with the nervous system, as many of you know. Most body psychotherapies today do focus specifically on the nervous system, the amygdala, the fight or flight reflex, the vagus nerve. All that, of course, is really important to work with. But in the realization process, we work with the fascia. We work with that level of ourselves, that tissue that's everywhere in our body. And that's the medium that we constrict ourselves with, right? That level of fascia is very sensitive to the mind. And it means, because it's everywhere in our body, that we can constrict ourselves deep in our chest, where we certainly can't feel it, because wherever we constrict ourselves, we've lost contact with ourselves. But even a therapist or a healer or a good friend, lover might not be able to see it, might not know. But they might know that, oh, you're having difficulty loving, you're having difficulty feeling emotional responsiveness. But they might not know about this constriction that's deep in the body. We need to be able to get to that ourselves. By the way, let me say here that Jeffrey talked about my books, didn't mention my most current book, which is Trauma and the Unbound Body. And if you're interested in this work as a way of healing from trauma, that's really the book I would suggest, Trauma and the Unbound Body. It's my most recent book, so the clearest, most clearly presented, but also talks specifically about how to release these constrictions through that we've made in our fascia, everywhere in our body, deeply within our body. By the way, that's not pathology. That's not like, oh man, she's constricted. No, we're all like that. We all grow up to some extent like that because we're defenseless children. We're little babies. We hear an angry voice in the next room. We're growing up in a normal human environment, which is never all sweetness and light, and so we protect ourselves automatically. We also constrict ourselves as a way of mirroring our parents' constriction, right? So this patterning is passed down generation to generation to generation. Sometimes people will ask me a very good question, whether the memories that are bound in our body, because that's what we do, we bind the memory of the traumatic event in that constriction, whether the memories are passed down generation to generation to generation. That's a wonderful topic to explore, right? And it's certainly a possibility. But certainly, definitely, I can say, we hold the memories from our present life in our constrictions, and we also mirror the patterns of tension and openness that we see in our parents, right? So our family all lives up here. We're smarties, but we don't really like to mess with those emotions too much. Definitely nothing below the belt. Then the baby would just automatically pattern themselves on that in order to feel in contact with the family, in order to feel like part of the family. Okay. So part of the realization process is a technique, the release technique. And again, we need to have been able to inhabit the body, tune to fundamental consciousness, and access that vertical innermost core of ourselves in order to do this realization process, release technique. But it is a way of focusing within the tensions, within these constrictions, and releasing them. I'm not going to teach that. It is in the books, but I'm not going to teach it because it's kind of powerful to be led through it, and I can't see who I'm speaking to. And also, some of you may not have done, most of you probably have not have done the basic realization process practices, and those need to be done first. So today, as a presentation, in this presentation, I'm going to just teach you very quickly the being in the body, not the whole practice, because that takes half an hour, And then I'm going to focus on teaching you this core breath, okay? And I think I will go into that now. So, yeah, so come sit up and focus on your breathing to begin with. And one way that we really can help calm ourselves is to calm the breath, to even it, 3 counts in, 3 counts out, or whatever number is comfortable for you without strain. And you can even breathe calm breath. And you can even rest your thinking mind on your breath. So nothing's happening right now, except the breath going in and out. And now come down to your feet and feel that you're inside your feet. So not just aware of your feet, actually entering into them as if you were present and living within your feet. And make sure that you can continue to breathe while being in your feet, that your inhale doesn't lift you up away from your feet. Take a moment to really experience yourself there, living inside your feet. And now I'm going to ask you to enter into your whole body in the same way. So I'm not doing the whole practice. We're not going to attune to those qualities today. Just entering into your whole body the best that you can, in the same way that you entered into your feet. It means you're feeling contact everywhere in your body. And continuing to breathe. Find the space outside your body. You can keep your eyes closed for this, eyes closed or open. Find the space in the room. Right? So not visually, just finding it. And let yourself experience that the space inside and outside your body is the same continuous space. Right? You're still in your body, but you're permeable. Space inside and outside is the same. And this is a practice, right? This would take much more practice than this to really experience it, but just a tiny glimpse of it for those of you who can. We're going to go now into the core breath. Find the center of your head. This point, the center of the head, is somewhere between your ears. You need to find it by the feel of it. It has a little vibrational feeling. It's in the very center of the internal depth of your head. And just by being there in the center of your head, it enters you into your wholeness. That means that you can experience the internal space of your feet without going there, just by being in the center of your head. You can experience the internal space of your arms and hands, just by being in the center of your head. That's right. It's an entranceway into our wholeness. And now bring your breath into the center of your head and back out again. The breath comes in through both nostrils, makes a single stream of air that can go right through to that center of the head. The exhale is release, goes wherever it goes. But be patient with it. These are practices, so could take more practice to experience this. So just to the extent that you can now, we're going to initiate the breath within the center of the head, as if you had air there that you could breathe. So the breath is coming through that tiny point. It's a subtle, fine thread of breath. It could be a long breath, can fill your whole body, but it's coming in and out through that tiny little point. You're breathing right there within the center of your head. And just by doing that, just by feeling that breath occur in the center of your head, you may also feel a resonance through your whole core. Very gentle vibration, all the way through that whole vertical core of yourself, down to the center of the bottom of your torso. Now find your heart center, heart chakra. It's in the center of your chest, but deep in the core of your body. You can let go your awareness to the center of the head, and you're just in this heart center, center of your chest, deep in the core of your body. Now, same thing here, just by being in your heart center, it enters you into your wholeness, your internal wholeness. And now initiate the breath within the heart center. In the same way that the breath starts there, even before you feel the movement of the breath in your lungs, see if you can feel it move in your heart center. Both the inhale and the exhale happening in that tiny point. Again, it can be a long breath happening in that tiny point. And just by breathing within the heart center, you may be able to feel the vibration throughout your whole core. So now it's going to be up to the top of your head, down to the bottom of your torso, just by breathing within the heart center. Take your time with this. Again, that very fine thread of breath within the heart center. Okay, we're going to do one more point. Come down into the center of your pelvis, but deep in the core of your body. Right? And just by being in this pelvic center, it enters you into your wholeness. So same thing. Just by being in that point, just by being there, you can feel the internal space of your legs, your arms, your head, your whole body. Initiate the breath from within the pelvic center in the same way. It's a tiny breath. It's a little tiny bit like smoking. And feeling the resonance through the whole core just by breathing within your pelvic center. Right? So we're using this breath to wake up that innermost core, and it'll happen gradually. Again, because it's a practice. Right? It takes practice. Now, we're going to do all 3 points. Again, very patient with yourself. Find the center of your head again. And just to be clear, I don't mean the forehead. I don't mean the top of your head. I mean that point somewhere between your ears, the internal depth of your head. If you can, find that point, center of your head, and your heart center at the same time. And if you can, add in the pelvic center, right? And if you can't, with practice, you would be able to. Sometimes even just by the second or third time you try, right? So for those of you who can, center the head, heart center, and pelvic center. Just by being in those 3 points, or 2, whatever you can do, it enters you into your internal wholeness. And now initiate the breath from within all 3 points. Keep the center of your head breathing. Add in the others as you can. And as you do that, you may feel that very gentle vibration everywhere in your body at once. If your eyes are closed, open them. And with your eyes open, find the center of your head, your heart center, your pelvic center, with your eyes open. Take a moment, right, to experience your environment from this core of yourself. Right? Usually we experience our environment from the surface of ourselves, and especially if there's some anxious stuff going on, we go way out to the surface. But here we have this core that we can be right in the center of whatever is happening, right in the center of it. Deepens our perspective, right? Both visually and emotionally, psychologically. Deepens our perspective, right? And if you can, with your eyes open, initiate the breath from within all 3 points, or whatever points you can do. Center the head, heart center, pelvic center, right? Eyes are open. I'm going to add one more thing, and this is an advanced instruction for those of you who can do it today, or for those of you who want to practice it months from now, as you've been practicing the first part of it. This is a disentangling breath. You can use this core breath to let go of your grip on yourself and the room. We'll still be there. In fact, things will be there even more vividly. We'll still be emotionally responsive, even more deeply, right? But we're letting go of our grip on it. We're letting go of our control, right? Our vigilance, right? And we're letting ourselves be right in the center of all that experience without trying to manipulate it, without pushing it away, pulling it in. So on both the inhale and the exhale, it's a letting go breath. See if you can. So this can help us not go into kind of habitual reactivity, right, to our usual triggers, right, or to unusual triggers that are occurring, right? We can be responsive without getting sucked in, without that reactivity. All right. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to open it up now to questions if there are any.
Thank you, Judith. That was really wonderful. I love the exercise, and you always articulate this process in such an accessible manner. I really appreciate that. I have a couple of questions for you. Since we're tailoring the theme of our summit to trauma skills, practical skills, and you've given an abundance of them. I had some special questions I thought maybe you could answer in terms of, again, a population that has experienced some trauma. So one of the things that many of my trauma survivors struggle with is being in their body, partly because of dissociation, partly because the body feels like the scene of the crime. So are there ways that for people who literally have spent not much of their conscious life embodied, are there ways to help them begin to move into the sensing process?
Yeah, of course, all of this work is meant to do that, but it can be extremely challenging for all those reasons that you've mentioned. And what I would suggest is to find somewhere in your body, if possible, where it does feel safe, where it does feel comfortable, right? And to start there, whether it's your hands, whether it's your feet, just even the tip of your nose, any place that you can begin to inhabit and recognize as your own self.
Great. Yeah. So giving someone a piece to do that's reachable. I was also intrigued because you had mentioned that involvement in this process, engaging in this practice, actually can help kindle self-love.
Yeah.
Have you ever found any of your students struggling with that, even as they're progressing with the past? Does this naturally arise for them, or is this something that one has to be mentored in sort of recognizing?
I think a little of both. These processes are not really meant to be done all on your own. They're meant to be done with a person, a practitioner, a teacher, or a therapist, and they're also meant to be done along with dialogue, right? So these go along with, I think, I know people disagree with me on this, but I think that understanding our background, knowing our history, what we had to cope with, and really believing that is very helpful for our healing. And believing it, I found, is one of the hardest things. And that's where the listener, the therapist, or the teacher can be very helpful. Yes, I believe you. Yes, that sounds awful. That was done to you, right? You were a child, you were a teenager, no matter what age you were, it was done to you, and you made these decisions based on that about yourself. So a little of both. There is that natural feeling of like, oh, I exist. Oh, I can't really be as selfish as my family made me out to be when I find this love inside my body, right? So maybe I behaved in a selfish way at times, but I'm not like basically bad, right? There's like basic goodness. We come back to our innocence, that ground of our being. It's completely innocent, and so there is a natural there's a natural arising of self-love at the same time as we also need to be helped along with it.
So certain psychologists look at the idea of shifting from certain states, state of agitation. You were talking about some of these somatic approaches look a little bit more at the nervous system. Would the differentiator for you, this approach versus general somatic approaches, is that the focus is on consciousness versus the nervous system?
Consciousness, certainly, and I'm actually working with releasing the fascia in the body, using that subtle consciousness to do that, to recognize and release the fascia. So, and the energy system, some of the more current body psychotherapies, because they've been scientifically studied and scientifically based, are not incorporating the more subtle aspects of our being that, for example, we were interested in the 70s before our science approached this. So in some ways, we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And now we need to also know that we constrict our energy system in reaction to trauma, not just shifting into, the sympathetic nervous system, but we actually actually limit our being. And with that, our ability to know who we are and to function as whole beings. So I think that's what differentiates it.
Hmm. I also like what you just said now about the idea that, our constriction, you said this during the presentation too, limits our experience of life, limits how much of ourselves we have access to, limits how much of others we have access to. And many trauma survivors are sort of phobic of strong emotions.
Yes.
So I could imagine that this practice could also help them feel like they could be with strong feelings without getting hijacked or drowning in them. Would that be accurate?
That's absolutely accurate. And it's something that I just left out, that I should have mentioned. That yes, that's one of the applications of this to healing from trauma, is that we grow a container, right? We access ourselves so that we can tolerate those strong emotions that we may need to release. We may need to release when we have those memories of our traumatic experience, but also that we can now tolerate our emotional responsiveness to life with less fear. Right? That we have that container for it. Yeah, resilience.
Right. During the pandemic, I know that one of the things that many people, especially trauma survivors, were doing was being activated by this fundamental sense of life threat, right? And having a hard time differentiating, are they in immediate danger right now because their body is telling them that, or is this something that we're sort of all experiencing together? And flipping back and forth between the perspective of I'm about to get killed, a trauma-based response, versus this is a dangerous, intense time. Again, in your experience, has the realization process helped people make that differentiation, get less caught up in their own thoughts and amplifications of fear?
I think so. I think, of course, any approach to healing from trauma will do that, will help. I mean, that's exactly what healing from trauma really is it's knowing, oh, that happened to me when I was 5. It's not happening now. But the realization process specifically helps us maintain contact with ourselves in the present, right? It's as if we're living in our whole being in the present, right? As we release the constrictions, we're literally releasing the past. We're releasing those memories of the past and those actions towards constriction that we went into in the past. And we access the reason that we need to have done the embodiment work before I teach the release technique is we release not into some kind of void, but into this ground of our being. So we're becoming more of ourselves, more of our emotional responsiveness and so forth, but in the present, as a presently living human being, rather than that traumatized child or teenager.
Exactly. I also like the perspective that so many people with trauma blame themselves for, why don't I feel anything? Or why can I feel nothing? I can feel nothing small, only really big things, or I'm numb. And to see that this is constriction, a way of showing it that way, and that this is unowned or disowned, but that it's possible to re-own it.
Yes. Yeah, it's so important. I also teach in the realization process practices for visualizing our parents or whoever was most formative in our early lives, and experiencing how we've constricted in reaction to them specifically. And sometimes we can even see that our parents themselves were constricted, right? So it's not that we were actually unlovable, but that person was not capable of that emotional fluidity and contact that would have been nurturing to us. So altogether, that, and even our present day relationships, one of the things I love most is working with couples and seeing, where they're open to each other, and they can feel for themselves where and even why they've closed off to each other, and begin to open that, and in that way, the relationship itself becomes that path to healing from trauma.
Right. It becomes a path towards mutually deepening intimacy, I suppose.
That's right. That's right.
Do you see, or have you encountered with your students or clients, any particular obstacles or struggles that someone with a history of trauma might encounter when they're trying to learn this practice?
So, the way we're defining trauma these days, we're all traumatized, right? But we're using the word in general very loosely as anything that we weren't able to really absorb as a really fully experience as mostly as children. But severe trauma can certainly make people very wary of entering into their body for the same reason, just as you were talking about in your first questions, right? It's just where they were injured, right? So to come back, it feels like they're going to be in danger, that they're going to be vulnerable in the same way. And so it just means the process is more gradual, is more begins with talking for one thing, and of course begins with that mutual contact between therapist and client, right? Between the healer and the one who's doing the healing. So that they know that they have a kind of a thread to hold on to as they go inward, right? If they know it's going to be met with some compassion, and then they can just begin to come back to themselves little by little, and there's no hurry. It's a gradual process. Every step of the way, though, of regaining ourselves, I found both in myself and also my students, every little bit of further access to ourselves is some fantastic kind of revelation, oh, I really can, love in that way, and so forth. But of course, if you've been severely traumatized, it's going to take a little bit longer even to begin to come back to that self-contact.
So I guess patience. People should not expect that they will progress very quickly with this if some of their experiences give them psychological challenges towards this.
We all need patience. We all need patience in our healing, and we need to be good parents to ourselves, accepting, patient, loving, compassionate.
Sense of humor.
Curious.
Yes. Why don't you just explain for a moment, in case some of our listeners don't understand that wonderful value about getting curious? How does that really help us shift the way we attend?
Yeah. How did this happen to me? I mean, rather than going off the deep end into despair, this happened to me, we need to keep alive a sense of, yes, it happened. How did it happen? What was it? So that we can, it's a kind of a hopefulness, that curiosity, right? If I can really understand this, I can really go back and look at the past and see what it is that's causing me to feel this way today. It's causing me to feel this limitation today. The release technique and the realization process is not regressive work. And I think that's very important. We observe with our present state in a curious as well as a compassionate way, that one part of ourselves, that one part of the child's mind that was fearful, that constricted against that fearful circumstance, right? So we're watching it. We're like, oh, yes, that did happen. Happened just, look how frightened I am. And then we can provide that ground of being, a present day ground of being, for the unfolding of the past to occur.
Yeah, I am sorry that I didn't mention your book before, Trauma in the Unbound Body. It looks fantastic. And I think it's actually even one of the gifts that you're offering if people buy the series.
Yes, the introduction in the first chapter is gifted to you.
Great. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, Judith, thank you so much for blessing us with your presence and your wisdom today. I always learn a lot when I speak to you, and I know that our audience does too. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
And a big thank you to all of you who joined us for today's presentation.